today on Ag News Daily.
Before we even put the first field in the ground or the first plant in the ground, let's get our equipment needs, our fertilizer needs, crop protection needs all planned out or covered. There are probably three other important things I want to discuss, though, in regards to getting a good plan. That would be soil testing, nitrogen management, and then field scouting.
Well, welcome back to the weekly edition of the Ag News Daily podcast. We are through trade show season, Michelle. We had National FFA Week last week while we were at Commodity Classic, and now we're into National Ag Month. March is here, spring is here, lots of things to be optimistic about, I think.
Yeah, it's definitely been a busy past few weeks, but it's great to get a little fall spring, some snow, but excited for the next few weeks for sure.
I've been chatting with a couple of different farmers from across the U.S. I chatted with one earlier today from Montana, and he said it's going to be an early spring for them. I think it will be for us here too in Iowa. So what's ahead on weather? We'll talk about that here in just a minute. But Michelle, what's weather like there for you in Wisconsin?
Warm, definitely warm. Yeah, that's how I explain it. A little wet. And that's where looking into some weather sources from this past week, that's what it also said. A lot of rain.
Well, let's take a look at more of an extended forecast here, as multiple spring systems are expected to track across the central and eastern U.S. here over the next week, pulling in some abundant moisture from the Gulf of Mexico. The heaviest rainfall is likely to happen in eastern Texas through the Delta and the Mid-South and into the eastern Corn Belt and Great Lakes. So definitely a large portion of the United States will get some rain here over the next week. For Midwest farmers, that means several rounds of rain heading into mid-March, including a larger system moving through this coming weekend with additional rain and the potential for some severe weather. Another system is also expected early next week. So as temperatures continue to warm up here, we're going to see more rainfall coming with that. And these rains could hopefully help chip away at some of the drought conditions ahead of planting season. Drought currently covers about 75% of the lower 48 states, but forecasters expect that number to drop below 60% by early April, with the biggest improvements in the Mississippi and Ohio River Valley areas. Some localized flooding may also occur as we see these spring showers come into play with repeated storms, but patterns could also signal a more active stormy summer as the La Nina weather pattern has been rapidly weakening. So certainly a topic we should continue to watch. Maybe a good opportunity for us to have Eric Snodgrass on the podcast very soon to give us a spring planting forecast and outlook. But Michelle, before we continue on to our next headline, let's take a quick break.
Farming comes with trade-offs. An extra pass means dinner in the cab. An early morning becomes a late night. Unnecessary restrictions turn into headaches. But when you make Enlist herbicides the foundation of your herbicide program, the trade-offs will be in your favor. Effective weed control that's ready to work when you are. Flexible tank mix options and neighbor-friendly applications, all without the need to jump through hoops. See what you'll gain with America's most trusted herbicide system protecting your Enlist E3 soybean fields at Enlist.com.
On some national news that we're watching and the impact on agriculture, we're watching the Iran conflict and what it means for our farmers. Rising tensions in the Middle East from this past weekend are beginning to take a ripple through agriculture markets. A key shipping route near Iran handles about 20% of the world's oil and roughly 1/4 of globally traded nitrogen fertilizer. Any disruption there is already pushing fuel and fertilizer prices higher. Analysts say urea fertilizer has jumped more than $70 per ton in recent days, while diesel prices could climb 40 cents per gallon, increasing input costs for farmers heading into spring field work. And we keep hearing some news from Josh Linville of StoneX of what that means for farmers and how he's continuing to watch it. So something we'll continue to watch here on Ag News Daily. But certainly this timing could be challenging for U.S. producers, especially in the Midwest, where about 3/4 of U.S. fertilizer demand goes to major row crops like corn and soybeans. With planting season approaching, delayed shipments or tighter global supply could raise fertilizer prices further. At the same time, farm input costs were already expected to rise 4 to 6% for the 2026 crop year, and ag chemical prices continue to vary widely, with some farmers paying up to 2.5 times more for the same products depending on location and supplier, according to Farmer Business Network latest fertilizer cost report. Something that's going to continue to evolve in the next few days. We are recording this podcast a day early, so something that happened last weekend, and it's just having that ripple effect every day here.
It certainly is. And of course, national news outlets are also covering this. So we're really going to try to focus on how this impacts agriculture moving forward. And fertilizer prices certainly are the very most priority. Oil prices, crop prices, all of those things are having a market effect as well. And we'll be sure to continue covering off on that as news develops. But as we look, Michelle, at other emerging headlines this week, we're seeing a sharp partisan divide emerging as the U.S. House Committee of Agriculture continues marking up a new farm bill that began this week. Ranking Democratic Representative Angie Craig of Minnesota warned that Republicans risk breaking the long-standing Farm Food Coalition by cutting nutrition programs and shifting costs to states rather than the federal government. Representative Craig said reductions to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, about $187 billion worth, tied to work requirements and other changes, could mean fewer Americans receiving food assistance, arguing the move could make it harder to pass the bipartisan 5-year bill. Meanwhile, committee chairman Glenn G.T. Thompson of the Republican side pushed back, saying that this bill should prioritize farmers who have struggled under outdated policies from the 2018 Farm Bill. But the dispute over nutrition spending versus farm program funding remains the biggest hurdle, leaving the future of a new farm bill uncertain after several years of extension. And I think I've shared this fact before in the podcast, Michelle, but 75 to 80% of the farm bill budget is actually allocated toward food nutrition programs such as SNAP. So the margin we're talking about here that would go toward farm programs is very small in the grand scheme of things. And I think that's where we're seeing some of the Republicans fight back and say, hey, this needs to be a larger cut of the pie. Michelle, as we gear up here for planting season, we're going to be hearing some continued tips from experts at Corteva AgriScience. Let's get into their quick tip right now.
You know, when it comes to fertility, I think of it as you can't drive your pickup truck down the road on an empty tank of gas. And the same is true in our fields. You know, we've got to have the adequate levels of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and even sulfur. So I'm going to say look at these nutrients as an investment in the crop's yield potential, because that's what they are. So for more information, visit corteva.com/US. and we'll fix you right up.
Well, in some USDA news, the USDA Risk Management Agency this week has finalized 2026 spring crop insurance prices, setting coverage levels ahead of the growing season. According to American Farm Bureau Federation economist Faith Parham, the spring price is set for $4.62 per bushel for corn, $11.09 for soybeans, and $6.19 for wheat. These prices are based on futures averages during February and help determine crop insurance coverage levels for farmers heading into the planting season. Compared to last year, corn prices are down about 1.7%, and wheat is down 5.5%, while soybean prices are slightly higher. Parham says producers still have a strong safety net through programs like Agriculture Risk Coverage, ARC, and Price Loss Coverage, with ARC County benchmark prices set at $5.03 for corn, $12.17 for soybeans, and $6.98 for wheat to help support farmers if markets decline later in the season.
Well, Michelle, keeping in line here with some government headlines, we saw some new MAHA movement this week as the USDA announced this week several new steps tied to nutrition policies and the dietary guidelines for Americans. Secretary Rollins joined RFK of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and USDA's nutrition advisor Ben Carson this week to launch a new strategic partnership effort aimed at encouraging private companies to help educate Americans on healthy eating habits based on the federal dietary guidelines. This announcement invites the private sector, including retailers, the medical community, farmers, ranchers, producers, and the media, to play a key role in encouraging healthier families and healthier communities. The department also previewed a coming rule that would require retailers participating in the SNAP program to meet higher minimum stocking standards for staple foods. In addition, USDA approved new SNAP restriction waivers for Kansas, Nevada, Ohio, and Wyoming, aimed at limiting certain highly processed foods and expanding access to healthier options for SNAP recipients.
Well, the USDA this week has also settled a lawsuit brought by environmental and farm groups after climate-related information was removed from agency websites earlier in the current administration. The case, led by Earth Justice, argued that deleting pages about climate risk and conservation resources limited farmers' access to important planning tools. Under the settlement, USDA agreed to restore the web pages and provide public access to the underlying data sets used in its online climate risk viewer. The agreement also requires the agency to keep the climate risk viewer available until the raw data is shared, allowing outside groups to recreate the tools if the information is removed in the future. Advocates say those resources help farmers prepare for extreme weather and access conservation programs, though some farm groups say uncertainty remains about which federal loan and conservation programs are currently available.
Well, Michelle, this is certainly a headline we heard Secretary Rollins tout last week at Commodity Classic, but U.S. trade deficit is forecasted to improve in the nation's agricultural trade balance, projecting the deficit will fall to just $29 billion in fiscal year 2026, down from roughly $50 billion a year earlier. Luke Lindberg, USDA Undersecretary for Trade and Foreign Agricultural Affairs, says the goal is to continue narrowing the gap and ultimately return U.S. agriculture to a trade surplus. But as Secretary Rollins said last week, it's going to take some time, multiple years worth of time. Lindberg also says that stronger exports are driving this improvement, and by the end of 2025, dairy exports were one of the highlights, up 15%. Ethanol was up 11%, and corn exports jumped 29% in 2025. USDA officials say boosting export demand remains the biggest lever for improving the agricultural trade balance and certainly commodity market prices as well, since the measure is based on the value of U.S. exports minus imports. And the last little tidbit from USDA was, of course, at Commodity Classic last week when we shared on the podcast, the USDA was sharing some early interest in the new Farmer Bridge Assistance Program to help supplement some of those trade deficit dollars we're seeing, with 37,000 applicants already submitted through the farmers.gov platform. And if you haven't signed up yet, there's still a chance to do that. Farmers.gov. Thanks for tuning in to Ag News Daily. We'll be back with more Ag News shortly. But did you know Ag News Daily was created in 2017 to bring the latest news, weather, and commodity markets to farmers and the agribusiness industry?
I did not know that. I should have known that, but since then, the show has produced over 1,500 episodes with guests from around the world, and we're grateful that you are tuning in to one of our now weekly shows.
In 2024, we launched a new video component, making Ag News Daily a weekly show in both video and audio formats, but we still show daily content found on our social media channels. You can follow along with us on every social channel.
Now we can connect with even more of you all across these platforms. You can now find us on YouTube, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, X, and wherever you stream your podcasts. So let's get back into today's weekly show.
Well, the USMCA trade agreement was often a topic that I heard last week was being discussed at Commodity Classic. But as we talk about Canada and the U.S., those relations appear increasingly strained following recent trade rhetoric from President Donald Trump's administration. A new poll from the Angus Reid Institute found 21% of Canadians view the U.S. favorably under President Trump, and just 22% consider the United States a reliable trading partner or ally. The survey also shows nearly 70% of Canadians want negotiations to take a harder line in future trade talks with Washington. Tensions rose further after comments from Jameson Greer, the Office of the United States Trade Representative, who said any future trade agreement with Canada would likely include tariffs as part of an America First trade strategy. Members of the Prime Minister's Council on Canada-U.S. Relations say Canadian negotiators are now preparing for tougher negotiations as both countries weigh the future of the cross-border trade.
Well, Michelle, farmer confidence ticked up slightly higher in February, according to the Purdue University and CME Group's Ag Economy Barometer. The overall index rose to 116, which is up from 113 in January, and current conditions index showed the biggest gain, climbing 11 points. But future outlooks softened slightly, falling 1 point to its lowest level since September of 2024. That future expectations index is now 45 points lower than it was in February of a year ago. Meanwhile, nearly 44% of farmers surveyed say their operations are worse off than a year ago. Concerns about U.S. agricultural exports eased a bit compared to last month, but they also remain higher than in December. And fewer respondents believe the country is headed in the right direction. Looking ahead, many farmers are staying cautious about expansion opportunities, with about 15% of respondents say they plan to shrink their operations, while another 34% do not plan to grow at all. Overall, the data suggests farmers are seeing some short-term improvements in condition, but uncertainty continues to weigh on long-term outlooks.
Diving into some more crop news, this week the U.S. Soybean Export Council released its third annual Soy Sustainability Assurance Protocol report, highlighting progress in sustainable soybean production. The group says 71% of all U.S. soybean exports were shipped under that program certification last year, verifying that the soybeans were produced under U.S. laws, regulations, and verified production practices. The protocol, launched in 2014, is designed to help global buyers verify sustainability claims while supporting nutrition security worldwide. Officials say more than 1,200 products across 22 countries now carry sustainable U.S. soy labeling, including Thailand's first soy milk brand to use the label. More than 207 companies worldwide has used transferable CSAP certificates, helping track sustainability throughout the supply chain. Looking ahead, the report also outlines new sustainability targets for 2030. These goals include cutting land use impact by 10%, reducing soil erosion by 25%, lowering energy use by 10%, and cutting greenhouse gas emissions by 5%. Leaders say U.S. soybean growers continue to use conservation practices to help keep production reliable while maintaining what they call one of the lowest carbon footprints in global soybean production.
Well, Michelle, we're still continuing to see new headlines and product announcements come out following Commodity Classic last week, and Wyffels Hybrids released an announcement that they're going to be officially expanding into northeast Nebraska and western Indiana for the 2027 growing season as part of its long-term growth strategy and 80th anniversary as a family-owned seed corn company. Leaders at the company say the expansion reflects continued demand for their high-performing seed genetics, agronomic expertise, and customer-first service model across the Central Corn Belt. Over the past decade, the company has tripled its business by focusing on strategic growth rather than rapid expansion. This move is supported by major investments in infrastructure and research, including a new production facility in Iowa and more than $100 million in upgrades to its Illinois operations. So if you're in those areas, you'll likely be seeing some Wyffels in the field here next growing season.
Well, transitioning into some livestock news, the Texas feed yard Lubbock Feeders is shutting down after 70 years in operation, marking the end of an era for cattle feeding on the South Plains. The 50,000 head yard was established in 1955 and fed more than 5 million cattle during its lifetime, serving as both an economic driver and cultural symbol for the region. Company leaders say the closure comes after sustained economic pressure, including cattle supply disruptions tied to the 2024 border closure ordered by the United States Department of Agriculture over New World screwworm concerns. The situation limited Mexican cattle imports that historically supplied up to 70% of the yard's inventory. The company says low U.S. cattle inventories, higher cattle prices, and rising input costs further squeeze feeding margins across the industry. Industry analysis expects some cattle feeding capacity to shift toward the Midwest as producers look for more stable feeder cattle supplies. So the question is, will that happen? Will there be significantly more cattle in the Midwest when we compare to some of our southern states?
Well, as we look at one more livestock related headline today, Pure Prairie Poultry has been found liable on 30 counts of animal mistreatment after a Wisconsin court ruled the company failed to provide proper care for chickens following its 2024 shutdown. A Buffalo County Circuit Court entered a default judgment on March 3, 2026, after the company did not respond to citations from prosecutors. The court imposed more than $13,000 in penalties tied to Class C forfeiture violations under Wisconsin animal mistreatment laws. The case stems from the company's bankruptcy and sudden closure, which left thousands of birds without consistent feed deliveries or processing support across multiple Midwestern states. Court records show farmers who contracted with the company were ultimately left responsible for caring for birds that were still at company-owned assets, limiting their ability to sell or independently process those flocks. The company has previously received federal support, including USDA-backed loans and grants, but later cited market pressures, low poultry prices, and lender actions as factors in their financial collapse. State officials in Iowa and Minnesota also intervened after the shutdown to manage or depopulate millions of birds that no longer had a market outlook. Well, Michelle, as I said earlier, I cannot believe that we are in March and soon enough planting season will be here. Through our Tips with Corteva Agriscience series, we'll be hearing from industry experts all year long. So let's kick things off with a conversation today with Ron Geis, the Market Development Specialist at Corteva Agriscience. Well, I'm excited to hear some tips from Corteva's Ron Geis today, who is the Iowa Market Development Specialist with Corteva Agriscience. Ron, thanks for joining us today.
You bet. It's always a pleasure, Delaney. Thanks for having me.
I love that you shared earlier you have 42 years with Corteva Agriscience. That is quite the tenured career. Throughout your time with Corteva, tell us a little bit about some of the different roles and hats that you've worn.
Well, I started in 1984 right out of college and had an area in western Nebraska, and we weren't selling a whole lot back then in that area. The plan was soybean growth would fuel our business, and because we were primarily a soybean herbicide company. I think at the time there were 50,000 acres of soybeans in 1984 in that area. And now there are probably 60,000 acres of soybeans in that area. So the bean growth didn't happen. But I was able to spend half of my time doing research work, which was really fun because that was a point in time in which a lot of those low dose chemicals, the ALS inhibitors, were hitting the marketplace, and, we needed those developed. So 5 years out there, 5 years near my home area, Seward, Nebraska, Seward, York area in between there. I'm sorry, about 10 years there. And then, about 20 years with the sales territory in Northwest Iowa. And the last 8 years or so, I've had the role of market development specialist, which is essentially the chemical agronomist. And I support the sales team and our seed partners and the Iowa State University and crop consultants, primarily in the northern half of Iowa. So that's the storied career.
Well, with that many years of experience, you seem like the perfect guy to give our listeners some tips today. That's really what this segment is focused on, is providing some fresh tips for growers as we get into planting season here in particular. So, with winter weather, it seems like spring is far away, but we're just months away here from growers getting started in the field. To get the best possible start this year, what are some tips that you have, Ron, about what growers can be doing now to prepare?
It does always start with a really good plan. Before we even put the first field in the ground or the first plant in the ground, let's get our equipment needs, our fertilizer needs, crop protection needs all planned out or covered. I'm going to say most likely the seed has been purchased, or you've got that decision made. Many farmers have made crop protection plans, or at least know where your equipment's at. But let's make sure all that equipment's ready, the sprayers are ready, and then when it's go time, we'll be able to go. I think there are probably three other important things I want to discuss, though, in regards to getting a good plan. That would be soil testing, nitrogen management, and then field scouting. So let's look at each of those. When it comes to soil testing, are you ready? Have you had a good soil test recently? Do you know where your baseline is at and what needs to be supplemented? So the nutrients that I'm mostly interested in are P and K and soil pH when it comes to looking at a soil test. But make sure you also have nitrogen covered. Make sure you have sulfur covered. If you haven't been using sulfur, I think you're going to see some good benefits. And if you have, you probably have seen those benefits. Now that we've cleaned up our environment, thank you ethanol, thank you biodiesel as contributors to that. But we don't have the sulfur coming out of the air like we used to. So we need to know where we're at and make sure that we put the right nutrients on. So when it comes to nitrogen management, nitrogen is a bit of a leaky system. If we get things too wet, nitrogen can easily leach through the soil if it's not in a protected form, or if we get ponding, which we see a lot when we get around the Okoboji area. Those saturated soils will allow the nitrogen to gas off, read greenhouse gases that people don't like. That's called denitrification. So those can be addressed and protected with a good stabilization program. And what we recommend if you're using anhydrous ammonia as your nitrogen source is to use N-Serve to protect that. Or if you're using liquid nitrogen, liquid manure, or dry fertilizer to protect that with Instinct. Same active ingredients, same protection, just different forms depending on what your fertilizer or your nitrogen's coming from. And what we see there is typically 8 weeks of longer nitrogen protection, whether we're applying that as a fall or as a spring application. It buys you an extra 8 weeks, typically takes us past those heavier rains that we get in April and May, and leaves more of that nitrogen when we really need it, which is, June and July, when the crop is growing rapidly and taking up a lot of nitrogen. And then the third thing is a good scouting program. Whether you're doing that yourself or contracting it out, using drones, knowing what's out there just helps to, tweak things through the season and be ready for changes. I typically say it's real important to scout for diseases in a wet year. It's real important to scout for bugs in a dry year. Those tend to be our biggest problems. Pretty tough to raise a crop of weeds and a crop of corn or beans in the same field at the same time. Something's going to give, and it's usually your crop yield.
Well, Delaney, there's certainly a lot of news that we're continuing to watch here on Ag News Daily. We talked about the fertilizer markets a bit earlier. So what's happening in other commodity markets this week?
Well, certainly we're seeing a lot of risk right now from the ongoing U.S.-Iran conflict. Outside markets reacted pretty immediately to that news late last week, but have since stabilized, with firmer contract values helping support agriculture in particular, especially through strength in the energy and renewable fuel markets. But growing global tensions are drawing criticism of U.S. trade and foreign policy, including trade disruptions with Spain after a military base access was denied and U.S. trade was suspended. The USDA will release their monthly balance sheets next Tuesday, followed by the planting intentions and quarterly grain stocks report on March 31st, which will be our first glimpse at what USDA expects to see the acreage mix here for 2026. And a lot of farmers I'm still talking to and retailers and folks working in the industry are saying there is still a lot of acres that are not committed yet for this growing season, as farmers are waiting until kind of last minute here to see how prices may or may not rebound to make those final planting decisions. On the livestock side of things, markets have pulled back from some recent highs and are looking oversold, but tight U.S. cattle inventories continue to support prices despite some weaker cash prices we're seeing across the country. So that's a look at our headlines here, Michelle, for markets for this week. But again, lots to watch here as we head into planting season, both domestically and geopolitically as well.
Well, we're certainly grateful to have listeners and to have us share, weekly news here on the podcast and daily social media clips. So if you haven't given us a follow yet on Instagram or LinkedIn, Twitter, now X and TikTok will be there. And so continuing to share all agriculture, especially this month being National Agriculture Month.
Absolutely, Michelle, but lots to cover off on today. Thanks to all of you for tuning in with us. But what do you say for today, Michelle? We let everyone go.
Let's let them go.